just finally want to introduce Gill Scampton and Helen Pedder from Pedder and Scampton Architects. Helen and Gill have been involved in the design of a number of residential and community support spaces for individuals with a wide variety of disability, including challenging behaviours. And recently Gill and Helen have been shortlisted for one of the projects that they've done around designing a unit for people with autism for the new London Awards. So welcome, Gill and Helen. I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much for asking us along to talk to your webinar. I'm Gill Scampton and this is Helen Pedder from Pedder and Scampton Architects. We're going to talk about some of the practical issues to consider when you're making improvements to a home for somebody with autism. We will talk a little bit first about autism in general, and apologies, you probably know it all already, but it does set the context for the rest of the discussion. And we're also going to play you a couple of sound clips so you can hear people with Asperger's talking about their spatial experience. They're not fantastic, there's a bit of background noise, but you should be able to hear what they're saying. So we're a small female-owned practice and we've been designing buildings for people with a wide range of disabilities for the past 15 years. All of our projects include lots of consultation with users and carers and service providers, so we've gradually managed to build up our experience with project feedback from each project. This is rather a smart domestic flat for somebody with Asperger's syndrome, but it does incorporate quite a lot of the general ideas that we'll be talking about later, so we may come back to that.
Sure, most of you all know this, but obviously people with autism are part of a larger group of the neurodivergent. Their brains process information in a different way to most neurotypical people. An autistic boy called Naoki Higashida has written and described it thus.
When a neurotypical person sees an object, it seems that you see it as an entire thing first, and only afterwards do its details follow on. But for people with autism, the details jump straight out at us first of all, and then only gradually, detail by detail, does the whole image sort of float up into focus.
In particular, neurodivergent people have different sense responses. These can be heightened or depressed, and when heightened can be to the point of extreme physical pain. They will be constantly bombarded with sensory overload, which is exhausting and prevents them from engaging with the world in the way that the rest of us do. As well as the usual 5 senses we all know about, there are the others which are vestibular, the balance and spatial awareness, proprioception, an awareness of your body's own position, something we're all a bit more aware of with COVID, interoception, which is the perception and interpreting the signals of your body's own sensations. And all of these can affect the specific elements when you're designing a house. Predictability helps neurodiverse people to deal with the world. There was an autistic man we heard from recently who was a keen rugby player and was used to making physical contact playing rugby, but when somebody touched him inadvertently when sitting in a train seat, had to go and went into complete meltdown for the rest of the day because it was unexpected. Change is unwelcome, so it's important to get things right.
Okay, so what do autistic people need from their home? The thing that overwhelmingly comes across is how absolutely vital an autistic person's home is to their well-being.
Being out in the world is frequently exhausting, so being able to come home to a space that is relaxing and reviving is essential to me.
Okay, so some of the key elements where you might provide autistic people with this recovery space. Ideally, the layout of their home will probably not be open plan. So, for example, space for eating and space for relaxing can be separate. The entrance will allow the residents to avoid unwanted or unexpected encounters when coming or going. So a porch can be really helpful. It can be somewhere for someone to wait before they step out onto the pavement or into a shared common space. Some kind of liminal non-specific space, such as a general hallway, which doesn't have a use attached to it, is really helpful. We were talking to somebody who was dealing with a supported housing for a a group of autistic people with learning disabilities, and one young woman would come out of her room at exactly 3 o'clock every day with her music player, put the music on loud and dance her head off for about quarter of an hour or 20 minutes, and then go back again and then do the same thing the next day. And she used the corridor outside her room as a space where she was allowed to behave like that. Many people will benefit from a small enclosed space to use as a reset space. So that might be a little tent for a child, or it might be curtains around a bed, or even a black painted room. We have come across people who would sit in a black room with a cover over their heads and noise cancelling headphones in order to block out the sensory world, so they could reset from a particularly troubling time in the world out beyond. And then access to nature, we find, is almost always welcome and soothing. So that could be a garden, it could be indoor plants, it could be something you can sit in, or it can be something you can look at, but it's always helpful.
Naoki has written, "Nature calms me down when I am furious and laughs with me when I'm happy. Nature is always there at hand to wrap us up gently, glowing, swaying, bubbling, rustling." Sound. This comes up as probably the most common issue affecting people with disabilities when we're designing, mainly as something that causes discomfort and sometimes something that gives pleasure. Loud noises of music, continuous background noise, such as a boiler or a fan, hand dryers, which are often noted as being torture, sudden noises, such as an alarm, noise from neighbours or traffic can all be difficult. So it's a good idea to try and eliminate these as much as possible when you're designing. Neurodiverse people can hear many things that neurotypical people don't. Most commonly noise from heating pipes or even the electricity running through the walls. Something that obviously, as we don't hear it, we may not realise why that's triggering other behaviours. And it can be easy to miss that these are a source of distress. Neurodiverse people don't get used to sounds and block them out. They don't habituate them. So an annoying or distressing noise carries on being distressing, and they don't tend to filter it out. So all sounds can be filter either, so that all sounds can come in over as a similar intensity. For instance, somebody's clothes rustling can be quite as loud as their voice when they're speaking.
So somebody with autism said the timer on the cooker is triggering. It's not just annoying, it climbs into your soul and pulls it out.
But there are others who like very loud music or the noise they make themselves. When we are carrying out house improvements for an autistic boy with very severe impairments, he loved the noise that the workmen made. And in this instance, acoustic insulation for the neighbours to keep the sound in would have been a good idea. Lighting and daylight, another common issues. The one on the left is an example of poor lighting. Fluorescence tubes, which can flicker and hum and have a frequency that is often disturbing. It's visually cluttered, and the emergency light is separate from the room lights, which it doesn't need to be. There are no dimmers or means of varying the lighting type and the light level. Ideally, one should aim for lights where the light source is hidden, and be very careful with LED fittings to avoid flicker, and particularly combining the right drivers with the light fitting, including specified dimmers so the light level can be turned down very low without humming, and have more than one lighting circuit so that lighting can be easily varied to suit mood is a good idea. If you need emergency lights, make sure they're integrated with the main fittings.
So an autistic person said, a home with variable lighting is a major factor for me, being so light sensitive. I can go into shutdown if exposed to too much artificial light. This renders me almost catatonic and unable to speak, in a great deal of pain.
Daylight, sunlight and shadows. Well, daylight's the best light available and is often appreciated. It's good for mental health, good for colour rendition and for orientation. But strong shadows can be misinterpreted as holes or bars of shadow, as steps or changes in level, and reflections can also be a problem. We're going to play this sound clip now, which is from our Asperger's consultation group, when we showed them this photograph of an architect designed space that won a prize.
I'm just looking at that picture and there's lines everywhere. There's lines on the floor, lines on the ceiling, lines, poles in you know,
Yeah,
in the middle.
yeah.
I would be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so another issue to be aware of is visual clutter, and we're also going to talk about roots. So many autistic people find themselves overwhelmed by too much visual stimulus in their physical environment. So the two pictures top left of a child's bedroom pre and post decluttering are really a good example of the kind of thing that would suit most autistic children. We visited an autistic children home where the rooms were, I mean, to be honest, almost prison-like. They were very, very severe, and everything was put away. And the staff were saying that these children would go home to their families and there would be sort of bedrooms full of glitter balls and My Little Ponies and things. And you could almost, they said you could sort of see them relaxing when they got back into these very, very, very austere, plain rooms. So provide plenty of storage so that toys and any other items can be cleared away. The flat that was right at the front of our building, our presentation, the client worked out every single thing he owned and exactly where he was going to put it and how many drawers he had, so that he knew that he wasn't going to live with any clutter at all. Another simple thing to do is something like the white boxes in the bottom right image underneath the bicycle, which is just like IKEA, simple IKEA plastic boxes, but for shoes, but they just mean that the hallway is kept completely clear. And then on the right hand side is an image actually of an office building where someone has obviously tried to do sort of trendy graphics, but this kind of thing can cause a lot of problems for neurodivergent people. They might have difficulty with entrances and changes of level and surface. So you need to keep them simple, distinguish the walls and ground, and be careful about pattern, hue and contrast. Colours can be nice to highlight a special place, but they're probably you know, a background rather than a highlight rather than the background for everyday life. And this sound clip is what our panel, Asperger panel, had to say about the image on the right.
This is cluttered. There's little signs down there, and it reminds me of a hospital.
I'd have difficulty, big difficulty with that. I wouldn't feel like walking down there at all.
Where does the autistic person hide?
I can imagine people making squeaky noises as they're walking along on there.
Okay, so the last of the kind of sensory things that we're going to talk about is temperature, smell, air quality and ventilation, which are all obviously related to each other. Most neurodiverse people are very sensitive to temperature, so it's a good idea to try and avoid big fluctuations and avoid overheating in summer and being too cold in winter. So good heating controls, blinds to keep the sun out in summer, good insulation to stop a space getting too cold in the winter. Smell can cause masses of problems. That could be horrible smell like rubbish or drains, or it could be a nice smell like scent or shampoo. Generally, those things should be carefully controlled and try and make sure that an autistic person's bedroom isn't too close to those sorts of spaces. Avoid VOCs and off-gassing. So that comes, VOCs are in quite a lot of furniture and the kind of adhesives that you use for sticking down vinyl flooring and that kind of thing. And many autistic people are really sensitive to those sorts of pollutants. And then smell associations can affect how somebody would want to use a room. So it's fine to have cooking smells in the kitchen, but they wouldn't necessarily be a good thing in a bedroom or living room. So hence the need for closed up spaces rather than big open plan spaces with everything in one room. Air quality is another issue, tend to be very sensitive to fumes, so traffic, VOCs again, and good quality air will aid people's concentration and mood. So you want openable windows, good controls, and ideally people shouldn't be living, for example, on a busy road with a lot of pollutants. It will affect people with autism even more than it affects all the rest of us. Good ventilation is a big help. So ideally opening windows, and ideally opening windows not over a busy road. but it needs to be accessible and adjustable and safe, and avoid drafts. Continuous fans, the noise can be really annoying, so specify ones which have a quiet mark certification, and ideally open a window instead.
Kitchens and bathrooms, those spaces we all spend so much time in. Certain kitchen arrangements can be easier for autistic people to use. Eye-level ovens, for instance, and fridges where it's easier to see directly in. And for people with higher needs, there are plenty of space for someone to stand alongside or opposite, so that you can work together. And islands are quite good for this. Bathrooms, ideally should be fitted out to suit the resident. Some people like baths, others showers. Hypersensitive people often like splashing and running water, in which case a floor drain is a really good idea. But some others hate to see water disappearing down a drain, so there are methods of hiding it. Useful bits of kits include plugs that open if a basin or a bath gets too full, and a leak detector that you can mount on a floor. Where you've got particularly high support needs, you may need to install wall padding or floor padding. This is a scheme that we have worked on for a young man who had four people in his support care team. So we even had to put sort of light padding over door handles and things because he liked to hit his head on them. But the thing to watch out is making sure there's airspace behind, otherwise it becomes very hot and sweaty and you'll get the risk of moles developing. Equally in the shower, it was lined out with fairly seamless materials, and in certain places bits of padding there as well. And we put the controls up at the level because he was going to have assisted showering, where the team could reach them and control them without getting soaked themselves, and that also it was out of the reach of his banging his head on them. And similarly, you may need to enclose various key bits to a house, like the TV, and so that they don't get instantly smashed. So there are these boxes you can get, and the same goes for radiators, where you can mount the controls within the safety box that could be either controlled remotely or with an insert key.
Okay, so what happens if a autistic person does experience sensory overload in their home, as well as the inevitable sensory overload they find out in the rest of the world outside? It can cause them physical pain, it can cause them meltdowns and shutdowns, can make them confused and anxious, could cause bolting, physical damage, or more repairs. We did hear of a young girl who behaviour was really pretty unchallenging most of the time, and then for 2 or 3 months over the winter got really bad, and nobody could work out what the problem was until an autistic person went along to the house and said, well, your heating pipes are really loud, it must be driving her nuts. So there was a problem with, water banging in the heating pipes or something. So those kinds of things can be really debilitating, and it can be quite hard to find what they are. But people then, especially if they live on their own, they can experience isolation, fear, depression. It affects their personal health and the amount of support required. When we worked on the project for the heavily autistic young man that we talked about, his behaviour really improved considerably when we improved his home, to the extent that, I remember, Helen, what was the
night care went down to a single carer, and they managed to reduce the day of care by 1 person. So it was a clear demonstration of benefit.
Yeah.
So when you're approaching the design of or trying to alter a home to make it more autistic friendly, obviously you really need to try and find out the residents' particular needs and his particular issues and particular things they like. No one size fits all, so it's difficult. I've seen some of the chain of conversations about modular extensions, which it can be a problematic. So it's I'm afraid often not standard housing. It's bespoke, even with small moves.
Then you ask them what they'd like, and obviously if they're not very verbal, then their family and carers will know what their preferences are. They might well have a special interest which needs a lot of shelving, or cabinets to store something, or a lot of books, or all sorts of things like that. And then one thing is to start with a blank canvas room, and then maybe, you know, the autistic person decides what color they want it, and then you just gradually bring in one thing at a time until they decide they've got enough things. You don't try and see the whole thing, build it up detail by detail.
Try and include some space that is liminal, non-specific, doesn't have a purpose, or, you know, that is labeled.
Consider whereabouts in the flat or house their room could be. There may be an option. Keep it away from noise, the boiler, the washing machine, the road, the neighbours. Keep it away from smells, cooking, bins, cleaning things. Try and keep it where it can have a view of the garden.
Consider secondary or double glazing, of course, to reduce noise. And roof lights, glass or plastic roofs may be an issue, but nice daylight is obviously a benefit.
Incorporate soft and sound absorbing surfaces. Don't have rooms that are too clattery. If you have everything completely cleanable, it's usually also acoustically very hard and clattery.
And introduce acoustic insulation if the resident likes to be very noisy themselves.
If possible, introduce indirect lighting. So that's lighting where you don't directly look at the light fitting. So it might be behind a pelmet, or it might be a wall light that shines up onto the ceiling and reflects back downwards. Put it onto dimmers. Make sure the dimmers and the drivers and the fittings on LEDs are all well specified and work together so it doesn't hum.
Use natural and low VOC materials wherever possible, and make sure the ventilation is good.
And make sure the autistic person has a refuge where they can reset. Might be curtains around a bed, it might be painting the room black, something simple. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great, Helen and Gill. I think there's lots of discussion in the chat box, I think, but no specific questions. But I think the key thing for me to ask you is, obviously cost of materials, etc., is just escalating. Is this impacting on your work? Is there anything that you're doing in terms of looking at more kind of cost-effective solutions that you're having to look at because of rising costs, or just because you can't get hold of materials? Because I think that's the other issue as well. It's not rising costs, it's also, trying to get hold of materials. Is there anything you're kind of doing in terms of reducing cost, or looking at different way of sourcing materials?
Well, to be honest, we do most of our projects on pretty tight budgets, so we don't really, and we do use a lot of fairly simple materials to start with, like using ply instead of plasterboard. But which materials are pricey at the moment seems to be varying quite a lot within our contracts, we've noticed. And so it's not necessarily predictable, but basically trying to make the simple moves that are going to be most effective is the way to go, rather than trying to simplify the materials, because you'll often be not onto a winner that way.
And think about the long term. And then there's always the issue about, do you do something that's kind of cheap as chips and really easy, that you can repair or repaint incredibly easily when it gets damaged, or do you go for something that's maybe more robust and will last longer, but is maybe more difficult to replace or repair and get damaged? So that's a kind of debate that really, I think all the way through, hopefully it's come across that you need to take into account the person that you're designing for, particularly with autism, because people are so different, and there just isn't a sort of one-off way of doing things, really.
And I would say that you really do need to get hold of builders who understand what you're doing, because where we haven't been employed for the full service, it gets watered down, and you get the plumber will rock up and he won't understand that you must box in all those pipes, and there's a good boxing in every last pipe, and so corners get cut, and then somebody turns around and goes, well, why did you design that problem in? But it's not, you need to, it has to be almost like an induction along with health and safety.
And I think that's been another debate in the sector, is around education for everybody. Do you know what I mean, in terms of design, from the term in terms of those surveyors, the builders, that level of education and understanding. Have you I mean, in terms of your own training, have you done any specific training, or has it been that what you've learned through that co-design process with the people that you've worked with?
It's mostly co-design, and we've got this wonderful sort of range of people who we can call on.
Right.
And when we're doing a design, we really like to talk to as many people who might be affected by the design, both the families, the OTs, everybody. But also we like to air it with our consultation groups, because it's always illuminating.
Yeah, and I think you could see that beautifully in the kind of your audio bits that you've built into your presentation, that feedback from people, just kind of what you learn from people just looking at that image and that feedback in terms of, you know, how they would experience that space. That has been absolutely brilliant. Thanks ever so much for your time.